more to come.
There's an unwritten rule that you never follow somebody who gets an applause.
We'll applaud for you.
Grace to and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
I have to apologize to Adrian because for the last, approximately 20 years of my ministry, I served a church down in Schnecksville, and for 16 years, that the new church that was built was in a round. And so every time I preached, I was walking around talking to people. I'm going to drive you crazy. I'll try to sit still. Over 30 years ago, my wife and I were in the office of the Early Childhood Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh, talking with a child therapist. The testing that we were down there with, my son confirmed that he had ADD, or attention deficit disorder. Quite frankly, we were there to kind of see how we could change him or how we could make him better. The other son had no problem with responding to our parenting techniques, especially with my wife. Our older son, when she wanted him to do something, she'd say, "I'll give you to 5. And she would start counting 1, 2, and by 3 he would say, okay, oh, I'm doing it. Well, our second son, when she started counting to 5, she would go 1, 2, 3. He'd go 4, 5. Now what? So the therapist said to us, in a rather different way that we had been told a couple years earlier by a rather wise woman, that we needed to cherish the gift of who our son was. And that wise woman happened to be my mother. But the therapist put it this way. She said, "Your son doesn't know how to be anybody other than who he is. He can't change that. But you need to change the way in which you relate to him." Which means you can't expect that the parenting techniques that you had used on your first son are going to work with him. He can't change, but you can. That was like a light bulb that went off. But at the same time, it was a realization of a tremendous challenge. Not so much to unlearn what we had done with our first son, but to figure out what would work better with son number 2. He couldn't help being who he was. And that kind of echoed through my brain for a number of years. Well, that's a kind of similar situation or challenge that is presented in Mark's gospel today toward Jesus by a Gentile woman and by a man who had been deaf with a speech impediment. They couldn't help who they were. This Syrophoenician woman breaks through every social barrier that should have kept her from talking with Jesus. She's a Gentile. She's living outside physically and outside the law of Moses. She's impure, and she's a descendant of ancient enemies of Israel itself. And she is also an unaccompanied woman. There is no husband or male relative who could speak on her behalf, who would invite the conversation to take place. And especially she was taboo by going up to a strange man and initiating that conversation. This chapter presents a disturbing picture of Jesus casting a derogatory slur at a Gentile woman who comes to him for help. But she couldn't help being who she was. And now this isn't the first time or the only time that Jesus comes across as being less than pastoral. He calls the Pharisees brood vipers. He calls those in the temple a den of thieves, chiding the disciples for their lack of understanding of who he is. He says, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you don't understand?" But more than rudeness, his words lift up the ethnic boundaries and degrade the gender of this vulnerable woman. Nothing unexpected for that day, mind you. Jews and Gentiles just weren't the best of friends. But this woman had obviously heard about him, enough to seek him out, and was trying to become part of a mission, even though Jesus was trying not to be found. There are a couple of theories about why Jesus says what he says. I believe that maybe God is using this woman to help Jesus understand the scope of his mission in spreading the gospel, while others see this as Jesus testing her. What the truth is, we kind of just don't know. But we do know that she's there not to make a point about what Jesus hasn't yet proclaimed, the good news in the world beyond Israel. We know that she is there because she has an ill daughter who needs to be healed and knows that Jesus has the power to heal her. Sir, she says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You know, embedded in that statement is a question. Isn't that good news also? That we may eat others' crumbs and be healed? And Jesus receives her word as discernment of that good news. He can only agree with her that God's love and healing power knows no ethical, political, or social boundaries. He recognizes the word that he has preached belongs also to her, to the Gentiles, to the world. Jesus' mission is to Israel, but others nonetheless benefit from the abundance of God's grace offered through this good news that cannot be confined by ritual, by birthright, or by a wall. And it's interesting that this insight comes from a Gentile woman and not from Jesus. Her attitude is one that is unique in the gospel, recognizing that she has no right to demand anything from Jesus. But in the abundance of God's gift, she need only request the crumbs from the table. Now, it wasn't her faith that opened Jesus' response to her. It's her reasoning regarding the good news Jesus is preaching. Crumbs do fall and are gathered up. But you see, the gospel is about change. We cannot receive the good news and not be changed by it. And if Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, welcomes others to open insights regarding the good news, to discern the presence of God's Spirit working among us, then how much more do we need one another for the task of understanding the gospel, the good news working within each of us? God has set us in community, the communion of saints, and invites us to think about the focus of congregational life and activity. Spiritual nourishment for the faithful is, of course, essential. But the congregation's mission cannot end there. As the example from today's gospel exposes, we too are called to a much larger vision of mission. One that aims to embrace the outsider, the stranger, and even the enemy. For those of us who are used to having our place at the table, perhaps we need to be reminded that none of us has any right or privilege whatsoever to claim the grace of God. We, like the woman, come to the table as who we are, beggars. And it is solely by God's grace that we too are fed. Maybe we need to be reminded that God's table is immeasurably larger than we can imagine. Even the crumbs of the table would be enough for our healing and our salvation. But Jesus sets before us an abundant, life-giving feast for all to share. Amen.
Amen.